Reformation Studies, Brownbag. My name is Bart Bitford, and as is my habit, I'll tell you about a few things we got going on later in the week, aside from today's talk. The Hall Center seminar this week is going to focus on a talk by Tara Zara from the University of Chicago, who will lead a discussion on her book, The Great Departure, Mass Migration from Eastern Europe and the Making of a Free World. A very timely subject, and that's going to be on Thursday, March 2nd at 3:30 p.m. over in the Hall Center. And then Friday night at the Kino this week features a Turkish film called Bal, or Honey. And you're welcome to join us. We'll be in here at 7 p.m. here in Bailey 318 for that. And then finally on Sunday, we'll be having our annual Spring Festival. This is our largest gathering really of the year. So you're welcome to come in and join us. It's actually going to be off campus at the Carnegie Building downtown. And that'll be on Sunday from 4:30 to 7:30. So we'll supply the blini, some fillings for the blini, some salads. Please bring a dish, bring friends, bring family. It's usually a lot of fun. And this year we've got a lot planned in terms of the program. We're going to have some songs, a little bit of poetry recital, and games and such. So it should be a lot of fun. Our speaker today is Evgeny Grishin. He is a graduate student working on his PhD here in history at KU. He focuses on Russian and East European history, early modern Western European history, and religious studies. His area of research is state and church power and lived religion in 18th century Russia, and he's investigated the experience of old believers communities in Vyatka region based on judicial cases preserved in the funds of civil and ecclesiastical institutions.
Thank you so much. Hello to everyone. I'm very excited to present here today. It's an honor for me. And today I will be, it's not a complete research, it's some preliminary ideas for a presentation I hopefully will be giving during ACES convention this year in Chicago, which will be where I hope to organize a roundtable on the quintessential of Protestant Reformation this year, Quincentennial, sorry, of Protestant Reformation this year. So, you probably know quite well about the old belief. It's a very old and popular story in Russian history, in Russian church history specifically. And you've heard about Patriarch Nikon, who became Patriarch of Moscow and all over Rus in 1652. And he introduced quite a lot of changes in the Russian church, specifically in the liturgical books of the Russian church. And here you can see it's a later 19th century representation of the changes Nikon brought to Russian religious practice. And those changes you can see on the left, it's old ways, and on the right, it's new ways. And here you can see the sign of a cross has changed. On the left, far left, you see a sign of a cross with two fingers, which are portraying two natures of Jesus Christ. And three fingers show thumb, and two small fingers show the Trinity. And on the right, there's a new type of sign of a cross with three fingers that portray Trinity, and two fingers, small fingers, portray two natures of Jesus Christ. And there are also, on the left, you can see the number of particles taken out from the Eucharist. They were initially, so it changed significantly. And also, there are some other things, symbolic things, such as the type of a cross, the one with 4 parts changed to one with 2 parts only. On the left is old ways, and then the right is new ways. And these changes sparked huge, we can say, I mean, it's a debated question, how many people really were bothered with that, but it sparked a division in the church. A lot of protests among lay and clerics who disagreed with these changes and viewed them as rather heretical. And in the end, this opposition brought a big, massive division in the church itself, It is difficult to count how many people really became schismatics. Of course, it's a very pejorative term. It's a term that's used by the official church towards the ones who disagreed with its ways. And however, the influence of the so-called schismatics, also known as old believers, was very big because they, by some estimation, they ranged from up to 10% of the population of Russian Empire. In the end, it can be even more. It's impossible to count people who are in dissent and who don't have official confessional organization, because they had communities, but they were not allowed to really practice them openly as it was normal for the official church. And of course, many such influence and presence of old believers, sort of hidden presence of old believers in Russian history, sparked a lot of conspiratorial theories, we can say, and a lot of speculations. The thing is that even though a number of old believers themselves was not that big, maybe 10%, right, their influence in economy was quite big, especially in some regions and in some economic areas. For example, in textile manufacturing, we accounted up to 50% of factory holders in the 19th century. And during the October Revolution, which we will celebrate this year already, another anniversary, they played quite a big role in the revolutionary events. Rybushinsky brothers and Konovalov, Alexander Konovalov, for example, they were the leaders of Progressive Party, which was not really pro-monarchist at that point. Sava Morozov, for example, even sponsored Bolsheviks. And of course, such things lead to speculations. And one of the recent ones I wanted to show, it speculates about specifically that, their influence, but what is most interesting that a lot of authors who talk about influence of old believers in Russian economy and politics were inspired by Max Weber's work on the spirit of capitalism. And here is a clear connection between Protestant Reformation and Russian old belief that basically, as many people would say, as historians say now, that the Reformation had mostly unintended consequences, right? Because Luther didn't intend to crush the Catholic Church, and he didn't intend that in a couple of centuries there will be a universal toleration. Almost 5 centuries it took, and still not really. Well, but still. And a lot of other things, the same can be talked about the old belief too, right? Since Max Weber made a famous statement about the origins of modern capitalism from the specific Protestant ethics, where schooling and the idea of predestination brought about the desire for calling for success in worldly affairs. Similarly, many people would say that similar events took place in the Russian church, and specifically among the old believers, who, because of the oppressive regime of the official Russian church and in the state towards them, created this very specific ethics that led to their prosperity and help to each other and corporativism specifically. And one of the most recent books that speculates about that is by Alexander Pyzhikov, called «Грани русского раскола». And this book is actually quite significant because it received a prize as a best book of the year in the by the foundation, one of the foundations in Russia, and it made a lot of sort of noise around, and a lot of people really commented that it's a very remarkable study. And what he's saying that basically the revolution of 1917 was a product of the schism of 17th century, because All the old believers were dissatisfied with the Russian state as it was in the 19th century, and we basically took it over in the revolution by controlling Bolsheviks and Stalin himself, and imposed their corporativist, socialist-like economy. It's a very long stretch, even to say really nicely. However, it says a lot about people's aspirations and the sort of fascination with the topic of world belief until today, and its influence on today's world, and it's connected directly to these ideas of Protestant ethics. However, what I want to talk really is not that. That was an introduction. I think what is important for us is to change the direction of comparison and not to try to compare the outcomes of the old belief or and Protestant Reformation, or try to somehow compare similarities between the teachings of the old believers and teachings of Luther. One of the biggest problems that because there was no one unified teaching of the Reformation, as many historians would say, there were Reformations, right, with small r, not the Reformation. The same we can say about the old belief. It's a very umbrella term which really unifies huge number of different communities and different points of view on the world. So what is interesting, I think, to look at in the context of the old belief and the Reformation is to look how different or similar was the understanding of religious change itself. In Western Europe and Muscovy at the time, 16th, 17th century, and the early modern period in general. So if we look at Martin Luther, I just took one of the, let's say, random citations of his to illustrate his view of what Reformation actually means. It is a Reformation grounded on the Bible and on the usages of a purified church. For from early times, the church usages became most corrupt. And I think it's interesting to look at that from a perspective of what the term reform means in this case, Latin reformare. We normally understand by reform something what changes for the better, right? Changes in something, a special institution or practice in order to improve it. While if we return to Martin Luther, obviously he's not talking about improvement here, right? He's talking about something else. And this something else connected to two ideas. One is old idea which is known by the Greek word metamorphosis, or Latin reformare, which comes from the period of early Christianity and grounded in the Bible itself. It's a personal transformation in Christ. Right? So when person being reborn basically again. And in the medieval period, to this idea added another a layer of meaning, which is sort of the rebirth of the society or the church itself. And it's not just rebirth, it's rebirth as a return to some perfect condition. If a man was in a perfect condition back in the heaven, right, in the in Eden garden, well, the church itself was in perfect condition during Jesus Christ and apostolic times. And this is what we also can see in the ideas. The whole term Reformation refers to that, or Renaissance, for example, is also another term which is quite interesting to think about that, not as improvement towards something better, but as a return to the past. So let's look at a Russian case and see what was the framing of the changes Patriarch Nikon brought into Russian church. And this word Patriarch Nikon used, and actually a lot of people before him, including the ones who became known as the Old Believers, but Archpriest Avakum and others, it was исправление, which we can see as in some of the texts used in the connection to correction of errors and eradication of the innovations. And you can see also the connection to Martin Luther, what he was saying about purification of the church, right, and return to the Bible as it is, not without all the additional meanings. So the Church Council of 1654 pronounced the changes in the Russian Church and pronounced the program of исправления, of a correction of the Russian liturgical practice. And what is also interesting to look at is the very book that manifested the changes, which was called Скрижаль, translated into English as the tablets of covenant. And it also referred symbolically to the return to the original initial stage of what Christianity is supposed to be. And interestingly enough, the ones who were the opposers of the changes Patriarch Nikon introduced, these ones with so-called old believers, were actually hold similar views on what исправление is. The question was that they didn't see Patriarch Nikon's changes as being really changes for better. They were changes for worse. For them, the church itself already was not in perfect condition necessarily, because they strive to correct some things, but in very is on the right path, let's say. So they viewed his changes as distortion or corruption or introduction of innovations. And another interesting thing that in this period of time, during the changes, Russian ecclesiastical elite was well aware of what was going on in Western Europe. And it was well aware historically, and it was well aware linguistically. The very word reformators appeared at that time in the documents. And the word that was used towards reformators, and this is a translation of the Greek letter of a Greek Patriarch Paisios of Constantinople to Patriarch Nikon. It's a translation from Greek. And this letter was published in Russian in the book Скрижаль, the tablet, which manifested the changes. And this letter was translated that Luther and Calvin, the words reformators, was dropped off completely, probably in order not to make a direct connection. But also, Luther and Calvin were called correctors, исправители, which is quite interesting to consider, because Nikon called himself исправитель, and here we see some sort of parallel between their understanding of what correction is. The only problem is, as opposers viewed Nikon's corrections as wrong corrections, this very same way Nikon and his ecclesiastical elite viewed Luther's and Calvin's corrections to be false, right? That they didn't actually change the church, the Catholic Church, to better, or the Christianity for better, but they changed it for worse. They actually destroyed it instead of changing it. That's why I think it's very important to look at this framing and words in this regard. And the last thing I want to tell, still quite a lot of time will be for our discussion later and questions. And the last thing I want to tell, that this understanding of religious change in this period was not just grounded in some backward mentality of the people. It was historically grounded in the Christianity itself, and in this sense, we can see parallels in both in Orthodoxy, in Russian Orthodoxy, and in Protestantism. For example, the Acts of Moscow Church Councils of 1666-1667 framed the changes in this way. The Master of Heaven sowed the field of our Orthodox state with the wheat of pure piety, but the envious enemy sowed the soul-harming chaff, while we, from God, whom God obligated to guard the wheat, were asleep. So, do you recognize this line from somewhere?
person who's asleep when the Savior comes, or people who put their light under the basket? Or?
It's a Bible, and specifically Gospel of Matthew, a parable of wheat and the chaff. So this parable basically provided the understanding of what changes and how the church is supposed to deal with change. And this explanation specifically is that there is a field which is good, right? The church, right? That exists with its teachings and so on. And all the changes and innovations are basically chaff that were sowed, as Jesus explained, by the devil himself. Wherefore, anything which is being brought into the church, including a new sort of understanding of what a doctrine should look like, were viewed immediately as chaff, as something negative and something rather corrupting the field of pure wheat. Right? And it was one of the foundations for really the eradication of heresies, because this specific parable was cited over and over and over again while discussing the change, heresies specifically. Right? And what one of the big discussions was what should be done with heresies. So the heresies should be, heretics should be gathered and burned. Yes, like direct understanding of what should be done with the ones who bring in innovations. And this parable gives us the understanding of the vision of change and the vision of time at this period. And so it's not just sort of backwardness, but it's a completely different worldview from ours. And this worldview was shared both by the people living in the Western Europe at the time and people living in Russia, and both Nikonians, so-called, and the Orthodox. So I think then the change direction of our vision, how of our comparative framework, let's say, and look at the bigger historical context of these changes, we can see a lot of similarities between Russian Orthodoxy and the Reformation and their framing of the changes and perception of time. Thank you. I hope it wasn't too short, because I was. Questions?
So, like, right, is it, I don't know, before or after, when, you know, they throw the seeds, some of them on hard ground, some of them in the brambles, and some of them in the good soil, and then so it doesn't prosper either.
Mm-hmm. It's a, I think it's a different version.
Yeah, it's a common illusion.
What struck me when, of course, this is not the first time you and I have had this conversation, but what struck me this time is that this fascination with apostolic originality, that somehow the goal is always to get back to the original, what the original church was, the original teachings, the original sacraments and such. The problem is, of course, that from what can be reconstructed about what's actually happening in the first century does not look at all in terms of that version of Christianity. If you just look at the texts, it doesn't look at all like Russian Orthodoxy or Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism or Calvinism. How do they deal with that disconnect between what the original text would say about what Christianity ought to be for the first century and what they actually really want to do?
Well, for the Russian Orthodox Church, the main thing was in direct difference with the Protestantism is a vision of what text we should look at. So it's not a Bible necessarily, but it's a tradition. First of all, 7 ecumenical councils and the writings of church fathers. And also here is the idea of authority comes into play immediately. Who holds the authority of holding the truest, best way to view what Christianity is supposed to be? What is the pure wheat looks like? And in this case, in the 17th century, one of the uh, speculations about what was the reason for a conflict is that Nikon viewed rather the contemporary Greek church to be the pure wheat of Christianity, which holds the tradition of true orthodoxy from the 7 ecumenical councils and holds all the texts, original texts of the church fathers, while the Russian Orthodox Church viewed it different. Many people in the Russian Orthodox Church before Nikon viewed it differently by looking at the Russian Church itself as an inheritor of the tradition, this tradition from the Greek Orthodox Church. They simply perceived the capture of Constantinople in 1453 as a sort of fall of the original and true Christianity under the Turks. So Russia appeared to be the only true bearer of what Orthodox Christianity is supposed to be, and they were the pure wheat. So in this case, it's not a one text, it's a compendium of texts and a tradition of its interpretation, which is connected to the ideas of power and of the tradition of lineage of hierarchy.
Well, I see that point. However, Nikon's way of reading those texts was quite different than his Russian predecessors. Very much influenced by the new scholarly innovations. He wouldn't call them innovations, but the new scholarly innovations that were coming in from Ruthenian lands and influenced by Greek scholarship. So was he just unaware of the extent to which he was interpreting the tradition in a new way, in a way that his immediate predecessors did not?
The thing is that it's a tricky question because we cannot really say that his predecessors and himself were drastically different because they read the same books. And this is one of the things that the opposers of Patriarch Nikon were really fired and influenced by Ukrainian tradition in the same way as Nikon was. It's difficult really to answer because I think it wasn't so much the reading as it was something about power. That Nikon's ways, Nikon viewed any resistance and opposition as heresy and opposition to him. So there was no possibility for dialogue at all. And at the same time, people who were opposing Nikon were immediately recognized any changes made by Nikon, with whom they had really bad relations at that moment, as heresy. So it was immediately the disconnect which just made any dialogue, any discussion about what actually we are reading, how we can interpret it possible. So it's really a question of interpretation, and some people would argue that Nikon was more into the progressive side of learning, while his opposers were not. But at the same time, those are all people from the same cultural milieu. And I don't think they hold different views drastically on what is correct and incorrect. Because people who opposed him very often were themselves characters in the printing house. And also from a Ukrainian origin. So it's a debatable question, really.
I don't know much about it except that, I'm kind of wondering, so I don't know, they didn't have the Bible the way they do in the Latin Church, or?
We did.
They did. What was the service like? Did they do special readings over time like the Latin Church? Or how did they inculcate their membership into this way of thinking?
Most of the time, in the cases of debates, we were talking about people who are well-educated. And these well-educated people read, and many of them were involved in the correction of the books themselves in 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. So we were very well aware of the Bible and its interpretations, and we have Archpriest Avakum's personal notebook where he's making notes from all numerous books he read and what impressed him, what didn't. If we're talking about simple believers, it's a different question. And for simple people, many of whom, not all, but many of whom were literate, their connection to the Bible was in the church, of course, from hearing.
I mean, usually the Bible was the first thing that was printed, and that's what got people reading, actually. They didn't have that in Russia.
But again, it's a question of a debate in the Protestant tradition also. But a lot of people a lot of historians would say it's not necessarily that people were so passionate about the Bible, but it's an authority of a state that actually imposed catechization on the believers.
Right.
So in this sense, Russia was not that strong of a state to impose this catechization, while Western European countries were strong enough to do it.
I think it contributed a lot to literacy in the Western areas, whereas in
Yes, it did.
it stayed illiterate a lot longer.
Yeah, but it's a question: what is first,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
In
it's
this
first the
case,
chicken or the egg.
yeah.
Oh, interesting.
I have a question, just if you look at what Luther read in the Greek and then what Nikon is reading, I mean, how does that compare? How similar or different?
Rather than Greek?
Yes.
Nikon didn't know any languages except
Okay, so-
Russian and Church Slavonic.
Okay, so how is he making this?
Now, those are translators. Those are people of Ukrainian or Ruthenian origin, as well as Muscovite origin, working in the printing house and correcting books and making.
So if you look at Luther, who did Greek, and his, I mean, how do they compare as individuals in these, as reformers, I guess that's.
I wouldn't fixate so much on Nikon and Luther in this case, because as we know, the Reformation is not the Reformation. It's a lot of different Reformation, a lot of different people who were passionate about the reforming, and they were passionate about the reforming of the Catholic Church long before Luther published his 1905 thesis, right? It was a long, big tradition of talking about how we should change it since 12th century, probably. Right, and in the same sense, in Russia, Patriarch Philaret was trying to change the books, publish new books, correct them, and so on. It didn't spark any problems. He also pronounced it as a ispravlение. After Avakum and Neronov and others, they came into power and started to correct books and impose this ispravlение also. It again didn't spark this sort of conflict. Well, Nikon came in. So it's more of a longer period of time with many actors rather than one great leader coming in and changing everything since today too.
So the personality of Nikon himself plays a role in this. You want to comment on that?
Nikon obviously plays a big role, but in 1658, when he got into a big conflict with Tsar, he was removed from the, not removed, but he left the church, and he removed himself, but he wasn't allowed to return. And the corrections didn't stop. And I think it says a lot about the powers behind it. It's not necessarily Tsar himself, but the whole, the whole milieu. It was important for it. And plus, of course, Tsar played a big role in that too, because he viewed
Nikon
it.
himself had a particular kind of personality, which perhaps made it difficult for him to negotiate. Is that a good way of putting it? Yeah, negotiating changes with others, including the Tsar. Yeah.
It is true, but if you think about people who opposed him, for example, Avakum, they had personalities that are not less stronger than his.
I have always wondered if Nikon had been somebody else, and if Avakum had been somebody else, if any of this would even have happened.
Maybe we can compare it to Patriarch Philaret, and I think it would be interesting actually to talk about that during our roundtable and ACES. How does it compare Philaret's ispravlение corrections of the books compared to Nikon's, and why only Nikon's corrections sparked the opposition?
I mean, I always heard that Russia was this way because they never had the Renaissance, they never had the Reformation. But it seems like there was something going on. Was there any long-term impact of this movement, or?
Yeah, definitely. It's just difficult to. I mean, most of the results of it are speculations, and then some would say that 1917 is a direct result of it because of the division in the society itself. That part of a society, especially people who are most pious or are simple people, would just distrust the political system and distrust the state itself, and would just distance themselves from it. And also we can say that a lot of political oppression originates from that too. That the way that the people who disagreed with official church and Nikon were treated and stigmatized and ostracized in the society, we can see its similarities and consequences later in the society where throughout the whole of the rest of Russian history, no political deviance was treated as a rightful opposition, but was necessarily treated as a dissent and heresy. I mean, political heresy with the rules.
Those are the old believers who were maligned and mistreated like that.
Yeah, we were mistreated.
So like our,
But again, it's more of a speculation. It's like a long stretch, and
And certainly it's not Russia was not the only society in which heresies, the state identified heretics, people who did dissent
Spanish
on religious
Inquisition.
grounds. Right, I was thinking it happened early on in Spain, it happened in other places too. So I'm not sure, I think that this is, you could say the revolution of 1917, or actually the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 is the direct outgrowth of this. Although obviously these threads are all become very much intertangled. The thing is that there are also the precedents to it, and one of the things I like about your work here is it isn't starting with Nikon, or even starting with the reformers of the 1630s, 1640s, but there are older traditions. If you go back to the 16th century and you think about Maxim Grek, for example, and what motivated the Muscovite authorities to bring in a scholar to try to recover the older meanings of texts and do translations, which he messed up, and then they got mad at him, and all sorts of bad things happened. But there are these older traditions there that of trying to recover a pure form of Christianity that existed only in the imaginations.
it's all imaginary. In the case of Reformation, it's also imaginary completely.
And it's very much, you know, as you were just talking now, I kept thinking of the Soviet period, which is also about heresy. and heresy becoming a state crime that is punished in a way that, I mean, so that tradition has really long roots.
We can say that the inability of the state to deal with a protest or deviance in a non-confrontational way can be viewed here in this period, the beginning of it. But I wouldn't really make such bold claims, honestly, because it's almost impossible to prove it documentarily anyhow. It's more of an interpretation rather than.
What do you make of the fact that this new book that proposes this direct connection between the schism of the 17th century and the Bolshevik Revolution winning a prize? Does that tell us something about what's going on in Russia?
Yeah, I think conspiratorial thinking is very much spread around in the society, but not only in Russia. I think it's a normal thing for the whole world. It's easier to think this way because such schemes, such models explain everything. And it allows you to blame someone else on.
What did Peter the Great's reforms have as impact on the old believers?
They had big impact in a way of sort of legalizing old believers by allowing them to be schismatics, which is a very interesting way, right?
He didn't make it okay, he didn't change their clothes.
They had to pay a fine, but like 50 rubles, which is huge. But at the same time, we actually don't have much of information how much it was collected. He imposed a special dress on all well believers to wear, like a sort of a joker dress, with, very bright, and so it can be seen from the distance. But we don't have any evidence of this dress. I mean, they have an evidence of its existing and being on display, but we have no evidence of anyone ever wearing it. So luckily, the Russian state was unable to impose its own laws, so many people were able to live more over freely. But at the same time, this repression that was coming from state sort of legalization made these people even more visible, because nobody wanted to be registered as a schismatic. Like, you are being registered as an enemy of the people, right? Who would like to? Because schismatic, and that's in the period of Peter the Great, also meant the enemy of Tsar himself. So who would like to be registered as the enemy of Tsar? Obviously not that many people.
So were there no records because they were destroyed, or did they not keep any kind of records? Or, I mean, usually church records are pretty good in all kinds of places. Did the Russian Orthodox Church not keep records?
Russian Orthodox Church kept a lot of records, and they also kept records of confessions. And this was the only way to recognize who is schismatic and who is not. And these confessional registers were imposed already in the 17th century, end of it. But again,
They put names down?
yeah, we put names, and when this person confessed and then didn't confess, if you don't confess 3 times, you automatically become a schismatic. So it created another problem, which is bribery. And also, there is a problem with confession, that it's not only schismatics who would not confess. It was a very common phenomenon for Russia, that it seems like the common belief was, until the 19th century, that there's only one confession a person needs to make, confession and Eucharist, and it's before death.
Like last sacrament.
Yeah. So many people would just go there. I assume there was some sort of association between, if you confess, maybe you will die after it, maybe. Again, it's a speculation because we don't have anyone writing down, like, I don't confess because.
But there are other reasons not to go to confession. If you go to confession and you have to confess sins, then you get put under penances, and that's annoying because then you have to fulfill.
They weren't just
them.
3 Hail Marys?
No. And some of the penances are not carried out privately. They're carried out, visibly to public, exclusion from communion, for example, so everybody knows that you don't belong, and there are lots of reasons why people wouldn't want to do it. In addition to not wanting to associate with the official church. So.
And plus, we shouldn't forget that priests at that time were dependent on their parishioners, who actually fed them completely. We didn't have.
If you go to confession, then you have to pay the priest.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't go, you also have to
So
pay.
he gets fat and you get thin.
So therefore, I mean, priests didn't have an incentive actually to report correctly on their parishioners. So it was a reciprocal relationships. Yes.
I'm wondering if all this caused any sort of, if there's any evidence of emigration or movement, migration of people out of this area.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So to where?
Definitely. Already in the 17th century, a lot of people migrated to Siberia, and they tried to go as far as possible from the state, but state reached them in the end.
From St. Petersburg or from Moscow?
Oh, no, from the central Russia, Moscow, and around the whole European Russia. At the same time, a lot of people tried to escape in the north of Russia, and again the state reached them, so we tried to escape in Poland in huge numbers. So in the end, later Austro-Hungary, in the end, the whole area actually, like all the territories around Russia, including Turkey, had around the Russian Empire, had substantial communities of rational believers, and this factor was also always, but often used in politics, like we recently saw the claims about Russians living abroad, right, and in Ukraine or in our territories, and we need to reclaim this, right, these people. And back in the 17th century, 18th century, some officials would say we're Russians living in Poland, so it's our rightful claim actually to take this territory. So it's an interesting question. And plus, in the 20th century, a lot of people after the revolution immigrated to China, from China to Brazil, Paraguay, eventually the United States, Mexico, and spread around.
I had a question on when you were talking about the text of the parable and the burning and et cetera. How, which is a little bit off topic, is how does this self-immolation that the believers either practice, how does that figure into either their cosmology, how they're, and how, with heretics being burned, but also burning, sacrificing. If you could maybe speak to that.
Okay. The thing is that after the persecution of the ones who didn't submit to the orders of the official church and the new changes, a lot of people, some of them decided to run away, and many of them actually burned themselves to death in collective self-immolation. They would just close the doors in a big barn and then just fire up. And up to 20,000 people. And these cases were happening up to the 19th century, whereas some cases in the 19th century. They mostly stopped in the 18th century. So it was a horrific event, really, horrific phenomenon. And how did they conceptualize? It's a question also of speculation mostly, because people who burned themselves didn't leave any notes about why we did it. They tried to escape the power of Antichrist, because of after the start of the persecution, the idea of Antichrist ruling the Russian church, of course, came into play, and in this apocalyptically charged atmosphere. I didn't see any evidence of the connection between the parable of wheat and chaff and self-immolations, and I don't think it exists really, because it says that ones who are being burned are actually heretics. And it was used by the polemicists, Orthodox premicists, to say that actually, you see, they burn themselves, right? Yeah. So it's
an interesting
Yeah.
problem, though, why they would, I mean, you can understand why they would commit suicide, because they don't want to be tainted through contact with the state, but that particular method of suicide, which is used so consistently, what comes to my mind were the tales that were circulating about the end of the world.
The end times.
The end times, Palladius, for example, and which was a very popular tale, not only among all believers, but in general in the 17th, 18th centuries, which really, there's a lot of talk about the fire coming down from the heavens to, destroy everything on the earth. And then there's the judgment, with people being ascended different, the good guys go up there, or the bad guys go down below.
Is it a purifying fire rather than a?
Well, it's a fire that comes from heaven, so obviously in some ways it is a purifying fire, but it's not as though the only people it's only the good people who get burned and the bad people don't. But it destroys everything.
But also, what kind of options did people have? There were cases of starving to death, for example, is one of the options. Before the Nikon's changes were already really not that big, but still movements are apocalyptically inspired that end of time is coming, because think of it's 1666. Right? Of course, Russia didn't at the time use the calendar starting from the birth of Jesus. It was a calendar starting from the creation of the world. But the idea of the old coming of age was widespread since the 14th century.
And they are making reference to the calendar starting from Christ more and more often in the 1650s. So sometimes you will get both dates. Not so much in state documents, of course, but in some of the ecclesiastical, I've seen these things, dates.
Actually, do you know what happened to the Jewish population during this period? Were they oppressed more, or they just?
In Russia, there was
Yeah.
basically, literally, almost no Jewish population at the time.
Except in Ukraine.
Really? Oh, so who went to the Pale of Settlement then?
Oh, the Pale of Settlement grows. Russian
It
grows
grows.
and takes over.
Oh, is that what happened?
Yeah, and, yeah, so
Does
that's
that-
how they get a Jewish population.
Because
There-
a lot of my
yeah.
friends from Montreal, their families were Russian, and they immigrated like at the turn of
Yeah.
late 1800s.
Yeah. There was a very small Jewish population, other than in these sort of borderland regions that were recently.
Basically, foreigners, right? Doctors
There
and
were a
specialists.
few-
I've come across a handful of Jewish medical practitioners in Muscovy. Some of them are, the references that they are converted to Orthodoxy, but others are pretending to be Lutheran and in order to be able to practice medicine.
Okay.
It's a strange phenomenon, but the Jewish population can't exist openly.
Okay.
And you may find that your friends are
Yeah.
actually not Russian, that they belong to the Russian Empire,
Mm-hmm.
but they were actually living in Belarus or
Okay.
in Ukraine or that part of Poland that
Yeah.
belonged to Russia.
Could the use of fire to kill oneself as a means of escaping, I guess, the oppression be ironic? Because suicide is considered a sin in the Orthodox Church. So by committing suicide, you are being a heretic. So could that maybe be?
There is no connection between heresy and suicide in this case, I think. But there's a problem, right? The world, many people believe that the world was taken over by Antichrist. So anything in the world is Antichrist, right? So by interacting with the world, you are basically leaving yourself out of salvation. What is the choice here, right, for the people? And they found the choice in this sort of purifying self-immolation. But I think it's a difficult question, really, and if we look at that simply theologically, we won't find an answer, because theology exists very often separately from people's beliefs.
How influential was, do you think, maybe the expansion of the Ottoman Empire at the time, and were they, as far as the divisions within Russia, was that influenced by the Ottomans, or?
Could you repeat or reframe the question? What do you mean specifically? How does it influence?
Just, is there any evidence that the Ottoman Empire was helping to foment division within
I don't think that was a period when really some sort of influence of this sort was really taking place. And plus, if we look at the documents from captivity, because Ottoman Empire existed close, and especially Crimea was not part of Ottoman Empire, but in direct relations. Islam is not viewed at the time as something that can really influence Orthodoxy or Orthodox people. It wasn't viewed as a threat. So I don't think, because simply it was so foreign, and not Muslims were foreign, but Islam was foreign for Muscovites, because Muslims really lived right next there. They were part of Muscovy since the 16th century. So I don't think it really played that any role in this way.
The Ottoman Empire was pretty open about allowing different religions to practice within.
One of the community, Nekrasovцы, so-called, they immigrated to the Ottoman Empire and preserved their old belief there.
Any questions? Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.